Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. If this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, we welcome you and we hope that you return for future episodes. And if you are a returning viewer or listener to the podcast, we welcome you back and we hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and insightful. So today's episode is a special one. And it's all about shifting our power to little people in our schools. So we're talking about our early childhood students, and we have a special guest, and they are going to talk with us about woke kindergarten, as well as some of the different initiatives that they are doing to help not only our students, but also our teachers, particularly in the early childhood stage. So who we have: an abolitionist educator, a consultant, instructional coach, content creator, and an overall creative entrepreneur. So they are the jack of all trades and Jack and Jill of all trades. So we're going to go ahead and get started and bring Akia Gross on to talk with us about woke kindergarten and everything that they are doing. So let's bring Akia on. So Key, what's going on? Welcome to the podcast. It's an honor.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no doubt. So how have things been with you?
Still a pandemic. Black people still being murdered. People still being oppressed globally. So, it's hard to think through about, I guess we've had no time to process. I think collectively, none of us have had any time to process anything. So I'm really just taking my life day at a time, sometimes a moment at a time, and just moving through everything. So not good, not bad, just moving through. How about yourself?
Same thing. Racial battle fatigue is real, and it doesn't just go away, especially with the perpetual killings of Black and brown bodies and just everything going on. It's hard to just distance yourself from that, but you try the best you can to take care of yourself and to still do the work necessary to support others. So yeah, I'm in the same boat as you are.
Right.
Yeah, same. So first question I always like to ask our guest is to tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to field education.
Yeah. So my name is Key. My pronouns are they, them. I wasn't originally hip to being in the education field when I was younger. I didn't have a lot of Black teachers. And so the way that education and teaching presented itself to me was in this kind of space of teaching is a white thing, which I think is communicated to a lot of us in as many ways. We don't see people that look like us or just move about the world like us or have the same experiences as us. And it becomes hard, I think, when you're young to be like, oh, this is a profession that I should aspire to be in. So while it didn't seem like something that was for me at the time, when I was in college, I was studying psychology and studio art. I was studying psychology and English, psychology and classics. I was changing my second major a lot because I wasn't really happy with the psych program at UNC Chapel Hill. And I was raised by an overbearing kind of helicopter single parent mother who knew that I was unhappy and ready to just be like, you know what, I'm gonna come home my junior year. And then she hit me up and she was like, I found the early childhood program and I, convinced them to let you apply late after just telling them about who you are and what you do. And so I applied late to the early childhood program my junior year of college, and that really changed my life. And as I reflect back on my experiences, I realized I've always been an educator in some form or fashion. I've always worked with kids. Even when I was a kid, I was a PE and computer buddy in elementary school for kids who were in our self-contained classrooms at the time. I was a best buddy. I did my service learning at the kindergarten I used to go to. So while I didn't realize it when I was younger, I reflect back on my experiences and I'm like, this is always where you've been supposed to be. So that's a little bit of my journey into the field. And I've just been in the early childhood realm ever since.
Oh, that's dope. So my wife is actually a Tar Heel grad. She did her
Oh,
graduate school.
word.
She did a graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill at the Kennar School for Business, I
Yeah.
believe. So she lived in Raleigh for a number of years.
Yes. My dog, my pit bull was named Raleigh for that
Nice.
reason. But I ain't really rocking with Chapel Hill right now after the nonsense that they've been up to. But I love another Tar Heel. I always love another Tar Heel. But the institution itself can kick rocks for the moment.
Yeah, shout out to Sister Nicole Hannah Jones and how they doing her right now. So yeah, it's sad what's going on at UNC and everything else that's going on, right? So you get an education, you have this concept of woke kindergarten, which from what I understand, you had been developing years earlier before it really became, public as it is now. So I would like to know what ultimately inspired you to start woke kindergarten and how did it evolve to what it is now? What's its overarching mission?
I've been in New York now for this is my 9th year. I'm not originally from here. I'm from Maryland, from the DMV. And I came out here initially to go to grad school. And while I was in grad school, the fellowship that I was a part of, the Zenko Fellowship, had me out in the schools in Harlem. And so I really fell in love with Harlem, which led me to stay out here. And I ended up working in a charter school over on 124 for the next 4 years before I left. And it was in that school where I taught kindergarten and I was an instructional coach of inquiry-based learning. But essentially in that school, it was like a rough time. I mean, it's a charter school, so it's oppressive.
Yeah,
It's
say no
inherently
more.
oppressive, both for kids and for Black teachers. So when I was in that school, I was basically the person that was always just, getting reprimanded just for my advocacy or for whatever, how it be. But my kids, first and foremost, like when I was a teacher in schools, my kids and their families were like my ultimate. That's what I was there for. And in 2016, basically, that's when we had our little ridiculous election year. And prior to that, I mean, I have always created my own curriculum or worked on curriculum. And so I was doing all this stuff in the classroom with my kids. And kindergarten really started off as an opportunity for me to share some of the things I was doing. So it really just started off as this Instagram page where I was like, how can I share what I'm doing in my classroom beyond the confines of these walls? It was just kind of just a running kind of gag, Key's class is the woke class, right? That's the woke kindergarten class.
Right.
A lot of people be using woke in all these ridiculous ways, I think, especially now that we have all these racist folks who are so anti everything that's good in this world. So for me, it was never woke kindergarten. It was really just a play on this. Key's class is a little woke class. So it started off like that. It started off how can I share what I'm doing? But then it just evolved initially when my kids, and these kids at the time, this was their first election, right? Their first president was a Black president. And despite the fact that, yes, President Obama's a war criminal and we're holding him accountable, the fact for a 4 and 5-year-old to see a Black president and then to see Michelle Obama, a Black woman, that's a big deal for this little person on earth. The rest of us, we only see white folks in these positions, despite how any of us feel about politics. When you're thinking about very young children, this is a big deal to them. So they all went to vote. All my kids went to go vote with their families. They came back with their little voting stickers.
Oh, nice.
And so when they came the day after the election, they were really distraught. They were really, really distraught. And so my co-teacher and we had to make space for them to kind of process those feelings. And I had created a unit called Everyday Heroes versus Superheroes through the lens of Black history and resistance. So we have been engaged in this study for months. So they were used to understanding what are the means of resistance? How do people resist? And so when I asked my kids, because they were expressing to me that they weren't for this, they were really upset. They were distraught about the election results. I asked them, well, how can you show people that this is something that you're resisting. One of my kids raised his hand and he was like, we can have a protest. So I was like, okay, stamp, like, let's have a protest then. And so we revisited like what protest signs like looked like, just the idea of what they look like. And so we just gave them some cardstock and some like popsicle sticks, and they went and they just designed their own protest signs. Like we had no role in it. So as they were designing, they would come over to me. I was on the rug. It would come over to me, and I was like gluing their popsicle sticks to the cardstock. And then next thing I know, I look over and a bunch of my kids are marching in a circle talking about something. No Donald Trump. No Donald Trump. I'm like, oh, okay, that's how we rocking. All right, like, let's take it to the halls. And the school that I was in was 7 floors, and we took it to every single floor. You know, it wasn't planned or anything. We didn't play no role in that other than to give them the space to figure out what they wanted to do. And that really shifted what, for me, like, how I thought about the work that I was doing, and also how I thought about, okay, you know, what do I really want woke kindergarten to be? So I took some time away from it. I also went through like a pretty significant experience in my life the summer of 2017. So that actually spurred me into eventually leaving the system in 2018, along with the fact that I had been wanting to leave anyway, because it's too oppressive and confining. But so I had to shift what I was doing elsewhere. And woke kindergarten in its current iteration really came from the fact that I had been out of schools for, if we're talking about 2020, I had been out of schools for 2 years. I was consulting, doing everything else. And I got sick very early on in the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know what I had, but I got sick. It was so early that it was one of them times where like you couldn't even go get tested. Like they wouldn't even let you.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. So when I came to in like April, I'm looking around like in late March, April, and like people have been pulling their kids from school. They didn't know what to do. People didn't know how to talk to their children about the protest. Like I had student teachers, I was doing some adjunct work at the time, who were trying to figure out how to do asynchronous stuff. Like everybody was struggling. And so I thought to myself, well, you know, we all got roles in the revolution. Like what can I do? You know, simply leaving the classroom doesn't mean you're no longer a teacher. It just means that you're taking a stand against this system. So for me, I was like, oh, I'm a teacher through and through. I'm an educator through and through. What can I do? And so it's just all those years. And I never wrote nothing down, fam, because I learned really early on not to ever put nothing on nobody's drive. I learned very early on to get IP clauses taken out of my contract. Like I don't play that game. So everything I had wasn't here. So when I came to, I was like, oh, now I'm not like, I'm free to do as I please. And really woke kindergarten came from that kind of sense of freedom, but also I'm a very responsive educator. So I'm like, oh, there's a problem. Oh, I can solve it. I can figure out a way to contribute to a solution. And that's really how woke kindergarten came about. It was like so many years of my experiences and just like, what do Black children and Black families really need right now? What do queer and trans kids really need? Like, and that's how woke kindergarten came to its current iteration.
And I appreciate the intellectual property gem right there, because you have so many people who are taking people's content, taking people's material and co-opting it for their agendas. So, you know, we got to shut that down because it's disrupting the revolutionary work that we're trying to do. So you said something interesting about leaving the system. And it takes me back to something you mentioned in another interview about the difference between schooling and education. Right? Because even though like we're not in the classroom, I also have been in the class for 2 years, but I still found ways to still educate, and I'm still learning, and I'm still schooling people, right? So could you just share what you mean by that distinction between schooling and education for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, in short, I usually just say like schooling is indoctrination, education is liberation, and they're two totally different things. Schooling itself is an institution and was never actually created to do anything liberatory for children. Like it really wasn't. Like if we're thinking about the American public school system, it really popped up and about when we're talking about industrialization. Like how can we put out these little workers that are obedient and listen to us? If we're thinking about what they used to call Indian boarding schools. Like the whole idea of a school was to strip Native peoples, indigenous peoples of their culture, of their humanity. That's literally what it was. And then similarly for our ancestors who were enslaved, like our ancestors were denied any right to education. Like that was considered a threat. Like literacy was considered an actual threat. Like if a Black person was literate, oh nah, right? So just this idea that we've always, Black and indigenous peoples have always engaged in education long before colonization came and tried to conflate the two, right? Long before the colonizer came and said, oh, schooling and education. No, it's not the same thing. It's always been used as a tool of oppression. Schools have always been used as a tool of oppression. So for me, the idea that you're saying that the only way my child can be educated is if I send them to this place with people who don't look like them, who don't experience the world like them, who actually mostly don't care about them. Like I'm sending them to this place in four walls where they have to wear uniforms and walk in straight lines and barely get to play and don't get to sleep and their food is trash. Like, how is that? Like, what are they learning there? To be good little, like, this is a tool, a massive tool. All of these institutions are just tools of oppression. And it's like, you don't want kids to be free. You just want them to do what you want them to do so you can maintain power and control. You want them to comply. And that's just not what it is. So just this idea that we have to send our kids somewhere to learn something, it's just nonsensical in itself because they learn it every day. We learn in community every single day, like the stories that our ancestors passed down to us, even just our cultural traditions and just the funds of knowledge that, Black and indigenous and brown children possess and bring to these schools. Even those funds of knowledge are policed. So, for me, schools, like the school prison nexus is real. Schools, essentially, so many of them function as literal prisons. Like we're not just talking about school to prison pipeline anymore. So many of them function in these spaces and in these ways. And so for me, it's like education happens everywhere all the time. It's perpetual, it's nonstop, it's infinite. But schooling is this thing that can act, that is just an entity, this institution that has been built to serve one people and it has been built to oppress. And so it's one of the many institutions that we need to be able to take down and just kind of get back to our roots. So yeah, schooling is indoctrination, education is liberation. You want to at me? Like we can argue about it all day.
Oh, we already know about that. You are not shy about advocating for that. And what's crazy is with all the talk about CRT and culturally relevant pedagogy, it's crazy how you have politicians, mostly from the political right, saying that it is ideological poison, that is indoctrination. But it's like, so it's indoctrination for children, particularly Black and indigenous and other people of color, to learn about themselves and their culture, something that they've never had the opportunity to do within the structure of this K-12 school system. Nah, you missed me with that one, right?
They don't want children to have the tools to be able to critique their realities because that is ultimately a threat. And, politics are also trash. Like all of it. So, we can have that conversation for days, but I'm going to keep it.
Yeah. No, for sure. That's a whole nother episode in itself.
Right.
I want to talk about agency for a second. We hear this word agency. We hear about the importance of building agency in our students and students being able to develop agency, right? But usually it's with our secondary level students. We don't really talk about that within the context of an early childhood classroom as often. And I think that's what I love about woke kindergarten is that you give students the opportunity to develop that agency through learning. So earlier you were talking about how there were certain teachers at your school that are wondering, well, how do we do this? How do we teach our students about these different things, whether it's social justice, whether it's intersectionality, racial equity, gender equality, all these different themes, right? And I'm wondering, what does that look like in curriculum and in practice with early childhood educators? And I know that's a huge question and there's no checklist for it, but what are some things that early childhood educators can do to address it?
Well, I mean, early childhood education in this country, anything related to early childhood in itself, it is social justice, because we have one of the most trash education, schooling systems, healthcare systems in the entire world. So the fact that, you know, people aren't generally worried about young children, we see that in our policies. Like, many of our policies are very much about, they're deficit based. So there's not as much focus on the little ones as there is like, how can we remediate after they don't get what they need?
Right.
And also early childhood in itself is a mess. Like, I mean, you look at a program here and then a program in a different state, and like, you know, I forgot when I was studying early childhood policy many years ago. I remember there was this like program in Florida, and like you only had to be like 16 years old to be a teacher in it. And then another Head Start program was like you had to have a whole master's degree. So like, our kids aren't getting what they need anyway. And also in this country, we don't treat children well. We don't. Like, from the time that they're babies, you know, from the time that they're born and cross over into this realm, the American workplace tells parents you only have a certain amount of time with your child. So like, you know, early childhood in itself is social justice. And if you're approaching it from any other lens, then you're not doing your children justice at all. So I think that's, people, I guess, have to understand this work as a way of being. It's not just like something that you add in, or like you know, like, oh, I'm like, it's not just about like representation, or like, it's not just about like, oh, let's have this like cultural celebration. Like, it's not about that. It's foundationally, it's like, who even has access to these programs, right? And like, how are you building relationships in community with families who might not even have access here? So I think people need to like take a step back and think about the lenses through which they're doing this work. And to me, you know, taking an abolitionist approach to this work is moving beyond the cultural responsiveness. It's moving beyond equity. It's moving beyond anti-racism, because, you know, abolition really is centered around, like, for at least for me, for woke kindergarten, it's really like, how does the prison industrial complex manifest in early childhood, and ultimately, how do we abolish that? What are we doing to abolish that? So if we're thinking about, I want people to think, like, you know, deeper than just curriculum, but like, how are you even engaging with young children and their families? Like,
Right.
in what ways are you confining babies? In what ways are you kind of forcing little kids to comply? In what ways are you, you know, surveilling them? What freedoms do they have? Don't they have? Like, what is that like? We need to start thinking about that before there's any curricular work being done. And I think that's generally not the approach, because again, too, early childhood is a social justice issue in itself. And the majority of people who are, well, actually every early childhood educator is underpaid. They're the least paid, and teachers are underpaid as it is. So you can imagine that these are people working, and a lot of people think I'm just a kindergarten teacher. Nah, like, I wasn't just in schools. I worked in every environment you can think of. So yeah, I taught babies, I taught toddlers. Right out of college, worked at a child development center where I taught 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So I actually know what that feels like. So I'm not just talking about other people. I'm talking about what I also went through, like being underpaid, having 2 degrees, being underpaid, being hella exhausted. And when you're in early childhood, you're changing diapers, you're feeding kids. And like, early childhood is naturally inclusive because you're learning who children are. So a lot of times kids aren't even being like, quote unquote, diagnosed then. You're just monitoring like what's happening. You're starting to notice, you have to take notes, and you're like, you know, I think something they might need this level of support or this level of support. So there's so much that early childhood educators do. And I say all that to say that I have empathy for those of us who are super tired, which is why I'm like, we need to also just think foundationally prior to curriculum, like, how are we humanizing our babies, our young children? In what ways? Because the dehumanization starts this early. and it just continues. So that would be how I would approach this. Is like really beyond all of this, how do we take an abolitionist approach to understanding how the early childhood realm even functions and like what that looks like for like our youngest kids and their families.
Right. And when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, we so often start around third grade and then move forward. But the reality is it starts so much earlier than that. Even the racial disproportionality of special ed students starts around early childhood. And I'm speaking as someone who had an IEP as early as kindergarten, so I know what's up.
Yep.
It doesn't just start later in your elementary years, right? But creating these spaces, these safe learning spaces for our students. And this is why I was a middle school math teacher. This is why I didn't mess with early childhood, because I knew that I didn't have the stamina or the patience to even do all those different things, like changing diapers. Like I have a 3-year-old son and I'm doing just half the stuff y'all do.
Oh no, what happened?
Like I have a wife and I have other people too. So like, and I'm still tired once the day is over.
I know how to change every type of diaper in existence. And I don't have not one child to my name. I have changed so many diapers. I have potty trained children that like, for real, like you are automatically put into a role of a parent or a guardian or a caretaker when you have, you know, especially when you have very young children. I mean, I think it's that way for a lot of us, a lot of teachers, and at least, you know, I would say like Black and Indigenous folks, because how we operate generally tends to be more familial anyway. But yeah, like, I mean, when I was teaching preschool in DC, the kids did not have to be potty trained before they came to school. And I'm listening, like, that is so stressful. And this is like, when I was teaching in DC, I was teaching in a charter school that very specifically catered to 3 and 4-year-old children. So all of our campuses were only preschool and pre-K. So like, imagine a 2.5-year-old come in and they still peeing on themselves. That's part of your job. Like, you have, and it's not listed in your job description, but it's just a given because the policy is they don't have to be potty trained. They don't have to know how to tie their shoes. All of these things, you have them the majority of the day, right? Like, I know quarantine was hard for parents because parents were like, wait, I said my children here for most of the day. And so that's what we're engaging in all the time. So early childhood educators, like, I mean, to me, they're the goats. Like we don't get enough respect for what it is that we do. And the majority of early childhood educators are Black and brown women. And that too, and a lot of like people who are immigrants or whose families are immigrants and like getting paid nothing to take care of everybody's kids. Right? Like, come on. Like we see that with nannies too, right? These are people who are giving their lives to other people's kids. And because the job is so demanding, they don't even have time to be with their own kids. No, the system is really rigged, man. It really is.
Super facts. And the fact that early childhood educators, they go through the same rigorous training as secondary level teachers. They take a lot of the same tests, sometimes even more tests. They're required to get more certifications, and yet they can't get equitable pay. See, that's a problem.
At all.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So I want to talk to you about this because, as I mentioned before, I'm a middle school math teacher. So I had 7th, 8th graders, you know, coming to me and they're telling me a lot of personal stuff. And what I noticed, especially in my last 5 years, is there are more and more students coming to me in confidence, you know, expressing how they identify in terms of their gender, in terms of sexuality, right? I've had students come to me and say, you know, Mr. Sarfo-Mensah, you know, identify as a non-binary person or identify as queer, and, you know, these are my pronouns. And all this is education to me. And at that time, I didn't really know how exactly to respond, but I knew that, you know, listen, no, do you? I respect however you identify yourself. And, you know, the fact that you would come to me to share that, you know, actually, I don't take that for granted because I know that there are a lot of other teachers who you wouldn't share this with. But I feel like you have a lot of young people coming out early and earlier with the information that's being disseminated out there about gender equality and just sexuality in general and orientation. So what I want to know is, how do we create queer-affirming abolitionist teaching spaces for students, regardless of what level they're in? How do we go about doing that, not just as teachers, but also as school leaders, because it's becoming more and more prevalent in our schools today?
Yeah, well, if we're talking abolition at all, like abolition is queer affirming, trans affirming, that is the work, right? Black trans women have been at the forefront of that work, of abolition work, for a really long time. One, I think it's really cool that your kids felt safe enough to come to you to share their most kind of vulnerable truths with you. I think that's dope and speaks volumes. And I appreciate the fact that, like, even though, I think you just said it, right? Even though you weren't quite sure how to respond, you still respected who they are.
Right.
It's really, truly that simple. Like, if you don't know how to respond, all you got to do is affirm this child and who they are. It's really that simple. And then go educate yourself, right? There are a lot of resources for us to educate ourselves these days. We didn't have them, even, for me, like as a millennial, even when I was younger, I ain't had this language. Gen Z got all the language. I'm sitting here like, ooh, I've been able to come into to who I am because now this language is readily available. But I really think it's that simple. Like, people think it's so hard to create these queer affirming spaces, trans affirming spaces. I'm like, actually, like, we make it hard. Like, people make it hard. Like, transphobes, homophobes, like, make it super hard because it's really just let kids be. If a child says, hey, I'm non-binary, cool, stand. What your pronouns are they, them? Awesome. It is literally that simple, right? But I think in order to be more inclusionary, like, it becomes complex because people have been conditioned into colonialism so deeply and so violently that there can only be this one way. And also, people are scared of freedom. They really truly scared of, like, what real liberation looks like, because that's what it looked like. It looked like everybody just floating around in whatever energy they are, dressing however they want, being whoever they want, and people are scared of that. There's no order, they think, in that. And so I think if we're talking about tangible things to do, then there has to be space. Like, what types of texts are you reading? Like, who are you inviting into kids' lives, into families' lives? How are you communicating that you aren't not even just moving beyond allyship, but someone who really, truly, like Dr. Love says, like a co-conspirator in this work and in this place and space of, like, how are you actively showing your community everywhere you are that you love trans people, that you love queer people? Like, I want to be able to walk into a place and not just see, like, cis heteronormative, pictures or books, or, like, hear cis heteronormative music. Like, it's that, there's so many really dope, like, queer and trans rappers and artists and, like, performers, and, like, there's so much. All you got to do, queer your curriculum, and if you aren't quite sure, also too, you can ask the kids. Like, ask some of your kids, ask some of your families. But I think at the bare minimum, it's so simple. Like, it's hard for me to answer this question because in my mind, I'm like, yo, this is so easy. It ain't bothering you that this child is sitting here saying, okay, my pronouns are she, her. Okay, cool. What does that change? You know what I'm saying? We have to be the models for that kind of love. We have to, not just tolerance, we have to show, like, how much we love them. It's not just even about accepting them, but how am I showing, like, the world that, like, oh, I love these kids, right? And giving, we can't just say a space is safe. So, I think about what type of community did you set up in your classroom that your kids knew that they could come to you? I'm really curious about that, because I think there's a lot of insight there of, like, when our kids can actively come to us, then that means we're laying the groundwork for co-creating a safe space together, right? And so a lot of that is showing who we are really authentically. And in talking to kids about, that type of, like, having that type of openness and space. And it also means that we disrupt, because this is what doesn't happen. This is, I think, the most core part of this work is you need to disrupt cis heteronormative patriarchy and all of that violence when it happens. Like there needs to be an active disruption of that, right? And then in accountability processes, like we're not talking about punishment and consequences. We're talking about holding people accountable and starting really young. So many people think, what can we do? Like, what can we add? What can we do? But a lot of this work is stopping things from happening when they're happening, stopping the things that you hear that might be violent towards queer and trans people, right? Like really engaging with that disruption element. I think that's where I would even start foundationally.
Yeah, and I totally agree with everything that you said. And also to add, just unlearning some of the misconceptions that we have when it comes to just gender and even sexual orientation. Even something as simple as using gender neutral language, right? So I was that teacher, and I'm guilty of this. I would sometimes refer to all my students as guys.
Mm-hmm.
That's wrong. But this is what I heard when I was a kid. I heard my own teachers using this type of language to describe a whole group, a whole classroom. So it became normalized for me when I became a teacher. But then through education and just through, coming across different students who identify as non-binary and queer, they told me, Ms. Sarfo-Mensah, I prefer that you use XYZ. I said, all right, bet. So it was a learning process, and it still is, right? What I also notice is on the other end, you have certain students who are visibly struggling to identify who they are.
Mm.
And I think it goes back to what you're talking about with regard to the fact that we live in a dominant culture where, we talk about white, middle class, cisgender individuals. That's who we center in this dominant culture. So the fear of expressing who you truly are, the fear of being liberated is real. Like I've seen it with my own two eyes. So I'm wondering, with you, how do you ultimately get to your own understanding? What was your journey like to get to accepting who you are as a non-binary trans person?
I think there was a lot of privilege in my experience. And I say that lightly because I feel like my privilege that I'll speak to should be the norm. Like it shouldn't be privilege to have a parent who accepts you. It shouldn't be a privilege to have a parent that has you in community with queer and trans folks. Like that shouldn't be a privilege. It should just be the norm. But in the society that we live in, that was my privilege. My mother is bisexual. Part of my privilege is like as a biracial Black person is like a lot of biracial Black children are raised so deeply in whiteness. And I actually didn't have that experience. Yeah, I would go to I had a single parent. So like generally like you end up with your mom or your other parent, whomever that parent might be, you're usually going to things with their family. And so like I would see my white family like at, certain holidays and stuff. But other than that, my mother raised me in Blackness and in Black spaces and with Black people and in community with Black queer people. So like, because of that, I had those privileges. I grew up going to like Black Gay Pride as a child. Like I was literally at Banneker Field across from Howard University back when they used to have Black Gay Pride. That's where I would go. So I grew up in that space. And also I went to Montgomery County Public Schools. And I remember like early on in middle school, this is when I started to understand my sexuality. I won't even say question. It's really an understanding. Right. So I think that's also what we need. We need to change our language around this. Right. Is like, I'm not questioning my sexuality. I'm understanding my sexuality. Because when we talk about questioning, we're saying that the baseline is being straight. And I think for me, like heterosexism, that's not the baseline for me. Like I'm a child. So I'm not even thinking about my sexuality initially. I'm starting to understand who I am as I get older. Right. And have various experiences. And so I started to understand that in middle school and heard about a homie I used to play ball with. Also, I played ball, so it was very gay space anyway. But which was a beautiful thing, right? Like, but back in the day, a lot of us just used to be called like tomboys. Like we just did not have the language. Like they would be like, "Oh, Key's a tomboy," da 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 da. And it's crazy because even when I was little, If my mother tried to dress me up for like one of them little Olin Mills photo shoots and put me in a dress, I would throw fits because that's not who I was, right? So you think about those things too. Like I know what I like, right? And society can say whatever they want. And that's the only point of contention is society. It's not how I feel. So I heard about one of my homies who I played ball with, like they were in high school and I heard that they had a girlfriend. And it just like opened up my world because I was going to high school the following year and I gravitated towards them. So I actually got lucky too. And this is a very brave person because wasn't nobody else doing this in the high school. Like nobody else was really out like they were having a whole girlfriend experience. And so I gravitated towards them. And, you know, from then on, I think I told my mother I was like gay very in my teens, like 14, 14, had my first girlfriend when I was 13. And it was never a thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just wasn't a thing. I was gay and I was out in high school. And that is a privilege in this society that we live in. And of course, like, it really wasn't my peers who came for me. It was their families. It was their families. Like, a lot of, like, the religious families, like, I would be looking out for some of the younger kids who are, like, online talking to predators, trying to look out for them. Their parents don't know it, but their parents don't want me in their house because I'm gay, right? Like, the very religious. So that's really what it was. It was like these kind of Gen X boomer parents who weren't really, you know, rocking with me just simply based off that. But even so, I understood myself as like, I think with the language that we have shifts from generation to generation. So like back in my day, like how I used to identify as a child was like a baby stud. Like, you know, and these days I don't, that's not who I am. And often, and now, and I use the word identify very loosely because we don't actually use that language. We just say, this is who I am, right? This is who we are. I am, you know, not binary. Yes. I don't not identify. But it wasn't until coming to New York and finding my community, which is like Black, queer, and trans community out here in Brooklyn, that I really came into the understanding of who I am. So what I say to kids is like, you have to find your community, and it might be hard in the moment, but I swear you will find them. Like, we are here. And we need more queer, trans, non-binary, intersex, gender expansive adults in spaces with our children to, if only to show them that we are alive and living. Because the fact of the matter is that these babies are dying by suicide at alarming rates. They are being bullied. They are being killed, right? So sometimes it's hard to see beyond, especially when your brain is still, you know, growing. We all know how it was to be a teenager. Everything was the end of the world. But our babies need to see that we are here and thriving, right? In our spaces. Maybe not like, you know, OD socially, but when we create space, and abolition is really about building your own, right? Like, we are here. And so that's really what helped me come into my own, into who I am, is finding my community and like being immersed in transness and understanding words like non-binary. Because I always knew like, oh, I just feel like me. But there was never any language for me to say that. And there's still, I think the language is still insufficient. Because most of the time I just feel like energy, you know? But I think that's the key. Exactly. Yeah, and it's constantly evolving, right? But that's such a beautiful thing because we don't want things to remain stagnant and stay the same. We want this to keep evolving. So yeah, I think it's really that core about finding community. If there's no community around, because I mean, of course, there's hella rural areas and places where kids are really in danger and it's hard to get out. And when you're in poverty, it's hard to move and get out. We need to figure out how we can connect these kids to one another, to adults who are like, who made it out. But that's really where it is sometimes it's hard to understand who you are by yourself. Like, you might know, but it feels lonely. And you might pathologize yourself because other people are pathologizing you. But to be exposed to other people who are like you and unlike you, I mean, that's really what we got to do. We got to make sure that we form those connections and tap into community.
And it goes back to what you said. It's really not that difficult. The same principles that we apply to when we're trying to show more representation of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, it's really the same thing when we're talking about young queer people. It's the same thing, same process. It's really not that difficult, as you mentioned. But you know what? Shout out to your mom. Shout out to your mom, because I wish we had a world where there are more people like your mom, like the Dwayne Wades and Gabrielle Unions of the world. And I know that
For real, I
Dwayne Wade and
love
Gabrielle
them.
Union are celebrities. I know they're celebrities and there's some privilege there, but they still get it too. Especially Dwayne Wade, NBA superstar.
And he did
Think
work.
about
He did work.
he did the
He
work.
had to do work, you know? He
Yeah.
did work to love, like he loves his child. And so he did the work, right? It's really that simple. Like it wasn't an easy path for him either, right? He had to do a lot of unlearning of, you know, misogynoir and like toxic masculinity and patriarchy. Like he really had to do that, but he did it because he loves his child. And I wish people understood it as it being that simple and being willing to do that work. But, you know, trauma, generational trauma, and so many people are unhealed, and people really need to focus on their healing before worrying about anybody else, for real.
Nah, facts, absolute facts. But shout out to them. You know, we need more people like them to really dismantle, you know, these narratives and just the way that we think about these things. Let's talk about just your whole creative vibe, because you're doing a whole lot right now. I'm like, how do you get sleep? Like Sisters Unsigned, Women Amplified, Black Children Play, Why Abolition. You have these different creative offshoots, which I do believe comes back to the whole idea of woke kindergarten. I think they're all interconnected in their own way. So I want you to just share with me what inspires your creativity, because you do a lot of dope things on that content creation space. And where do you draw the inspiration to create all these outlets to provide space to other people who need the space?
Yeah. You know, I think before I even knew how to name this type of creation, abolition, that's what it was. Because so many folks think about abolition as just destroying these systems. But really, we need to be thinking about what we're going to create. That is the most, right? One of the most important parts. Like, what are we going to create when we're able to kind of tear all this other stuff down? My creativity is just an inherent part of who I am. It's also, I think, part of my survival. And I don't speak to survival a lot because I'm more interested in thriving as a birthright.
Right.
But I have understood much of my creativity as like a transmutation of my pain, or like a solution to something that ain't right, or just a manifestation of the joy that I feel like me and other people deserve. So I'm really just inspired. Like, I'm able to kind of create from the kind of the sadness and the rage. That's really what I create from. Because I guess for me too, I'm a very like polarized person. Like if you look at my astrological chart, that's what it is too. But also just as a Scorpio, like so much of who we are is like constant cycles of metaphorical like death and rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what a lot of my creative process is too, is like a lot of it comes from the hardest, whatever I'm going through or experiencing or dealing with. And I think about this, I'm like, yo, Black people specifically have been doing this for the longest time. Oh, you gonna shut the door and tell us we can't go through a door? We gonna build a tunnel. Like, it's just like, that is literally what it is. So I do think a lot of it is ancestral. Like, I really do. And I have my father's side of the family was enslaved in Virginia, and my mother's like patrilineal like side died in the Holocaust. And so I really do think that a lot of it, again, is that kind of survivalist space, but also just like a rebirth of sorts in many ways. And so Sisters Unsigned in particular, which I'm probably going to change to Siblings Unsigned, right? I started a few years ago. But it's since evolved into centering like, all folks. gender expansive, non-binary, intersex folks, really came from this idea of like, we would navigate, my partner is a singer-songwriter, and we have this little kind of creative team, and that was Women Amplify, and that'll probably shift too. We would navigate performance spaces in New York City with Sonic, and they would be so violent. And we're like, not only are they violent for, and my partner Sonic is a woman, not only are they violent for women and queer people, but also like violent for Black and brown people. And like, there's all of these intersections, right? If you're not like white, straight, cis, they're violent. Yeah. So we were like, yo, we're so tired of this. They're not paying people. Like, and also there's some bomb independent artists out here who aren't getting the space that they deserve, the stages they deserve. And so Sisters Unsigned really came from that. How can we amplify the voices of women, non-binary, gender expansive, independent artists of color of all genres? And so we build everything. We build the stage, we build the bar, we run it out of this recording studio in Brooklyn. And we met so many phenomenal people from over 6 continents with this, like, and we really worked together to co-create a space that was safe and inclusive. Nice. Right? Because that's not just something that you could say. You have to work at it. Like, it takes effort and labor to actually be about what you want to be about. And it's just been phenomenal. Like, that in itself too was like my saving grace when I was in schools, because we launched this in 2018. I told you I left schools after that year in 2018. Right. So it was doing this work where I actually found my thriving and my safety and like my joy that actually, again, helped me move through the year. So I always like, I know people gotta, a lot of times, you know, I'll be on like Twitter sometimes, and like edu Twitter, it's real dry. Like, people need to get out more. Like, you know, like we can be other things. We're not just teachers. And a really great teacher is a great teacher because they are so many different people, right? We have so many different skills, and bringing that into the classroom, that's really how you connect with children, right? So that Sisters Unsigned has just been a blessing. Like, we do a lot of work in the arts. We had an artist residency. Black Children Play came again. I'm looking, you know, I create a lot of text. I'm trying to find photos of Black children. I'm Googling Black children playing, and what comes up? It's literal stock photos, or it's co-opted by whiteness, or it's one time I found children who were literally enslaved. And I'm like, y'all really don't want people to know that like Black children have any joy and are human. Like, literally, it's intentional. So I said, you know what? F this. We know that this is our reality. And so I'm going to create like a community source archive of Black children playing. And that's really where that came from. Is like, y'all trying to tell me this doesn't exist? Hold on, let me show you real quick.
Right.
You know, and similarly, and I hope people just remember this is like who you are and what you know and your ideologies and what you believe, that should always constantly be evolving. And prior to Why Abolition, which I've since taken a break on because there are so many people who are more well-versed in abolitionist work and have been for many years than I am. And my focus is really on what kindergarten and what it looks like in the early childhood space. But it shifted because prior to that, I had an organization called Equitable Schools, and I had started this initiative, Black Teachers Matter. And I came to understand that actually, like, we can't create equitable schools because schools are inherently racist. They're inherently inequitable.
Right.
So that was me coming to, when I kind of dissolved that, I came and like was accountable to community and also to how my own ideology evolved because of the community that I'm in and how much I learned from my people who love me. To sit here and be like, you know what, fam, like, this is what I used to believe because I didn't know. And now I know. And so it shifted, and that's how it should always be. And I think creativity is kind of a perpetual and infinite process in that way as well. But creativity is what not only has always saved us, but that's what will be our mechanism of thriving. When we get creative as possible, that's why they're stripping it from our children, because they know if these babies are allowed to imagine and freedom dream the world that they know they deserve, then it's a wrap for whiteness. And they don't like that. So to me, creativity, imagination, like visualization, like thinking, freedom dreaming, like we have that inherently. And that's why I always say, look to the youngest Black and brown children to do that, because they got it, right? And it's intentional when they are stripped of that. So that's really where it comes from, is like first as kind of a mechanism of like, okay, survival, but ultimately like the foundation of our thriving and of my thriving. And it really keeps me here. Being creative
No,
keeps me
for
here.
real. For real. And I think creativity is a tool that we use now to reframe the way that we think about scholarship. Because for so many years, we talk about the academy. You got to go to the Ivy League institutions. You have to go to a 4-year institution in order to get that proper education. But when you look at social media, and obviously there are certain influencers who you should definitely stay away from because they're not about that life. They're all about co-opting
Right.
and appropriating culture, right? And movements. So we have to be wary of that. But just in general, like we have to affirm the scholarship and the experiences of educators, particularly those that are grounded in, anti-racism, those who are grounded in racial justice, gender justice, and all these other social justice things. We have to center them and their experiences because guess what? Believe it or not, somebody in the academy is quoting you right now. They may not give you the credit, but they're quoting you right now. So going back to this idea of intellectual property, right?
Right.
Because they don't want to be the ones to admit, oh my goodness, I'm actually listening to somebody who doesn't have the PhD, who doesn't have the, these multiple degrees. Now we're reframing that just through our creativity. And that's why it's so dope, what you're doing with Woke Kindergarten and all these other outlets. So yeah, more power to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the last thing I'll say, and I hope people kind of take this to heart, is there's a difference between creating and producing. And a lot of times now, often we see that even creativity has been co-opted by this influencer culture and like content creator culture. And so this is also infiltrated education spaces because there are people who are out here trying to be like edu influencers. And even though there's like this element of celebrity culture that sometimes people impose upon me, which I find super strange, like I don't rock with it at all. Like I just don't like celebrity culture at all. But for me, like it was never about trying to be like have a platform and doing that. No, I just did what I would do and didn't think about those other things, which is why I find myself often being like, wait, why am I getting death threats? Like, cause I don't think about that. I'm like, oh, what do I need to do? But that's not what it should be. And that's why I tell people, you might see me go months not putting nothing out because this ain't about capitalism to me. It's not about me producing for your consumption. It's about creating for and with like our kids and families in mind and what we need. And so I create via spirit. However, spirit wills me to create. And when I really truly think about my own capacity, what I need to do to be able to heal, you will never see me kind of put this like, put things out before I'm really ready. And I don't just put things out to put things out. And I think that's what people need to start thinking about is we need to, abolish celebrity culture and content creator culture and influencer culture and really sit and think, what are we doing? Who are we doing it for? What is the purpose? And thinking about creating is really for self, the collective, like all of these things. Producing is for consumption. And I feel like creativity is liberatory and production is very capitalist and oppressive. So I think that's something that I really want people to kind of take to heart, to think about, to grapple with, to interrogate, sit here and say, oh, did I get caught up in that production? And all of us get caught up in that sometimes because that's just the way social media works now. Right. But you got to be able to stop that in the moment and be like, hold on, let me disrupt this real quick because that's not what I'm at. And if you get to that crossroads, take some space and allow yourself to recalibrate and come back into why you're doing this in the first place.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that because I look at the social media world, they're starting to operate a lot like our K-12 institutions, right? You see a lot of whitewashing of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are influencers, who are putting out truth, whether it's about the Palestinian situation with Israelis, whether it's about critical race theory, whether it's about white supremacist culture, right? Like you're starting to see that with like so many different social media platforms, the shadow banning and everything else is just crazy.
That's wild. Yeah. And I mean, and let's call what it is because it's genocide, right? So not even a situation with Palestinians, but actual genocide. And when people are trying to speak truth to power, because this social media is run by Zionists and racists and people who are actively like hold this kind of level of social and political power, who are making all these decisions. So that too, like, it is a huge issue, which is why, again, we need to get creative and feel, how can we do what we do off these platforms? And that's something that I'm currently thinking about too, especially as as we can start maybe being in community again with each other more. Like, I'm someone who has chronic illness, so I've really been taking, quarantine seriously, but I'm always a person that does, like, I'm my best self in community with people. And so I'm excited for us to start to think, what can we do off of these platforms, right? Because that's really where the real, or not even real work, because all of this is work in a lot of ways, but like, how can we get back to that level of self where we're not just concerned about the algorithms, but we're creating beyond how these spaces and places are ultimately trying to control and confine us.
Right. And even the constant changing of algorithms is a form of whitewashing.
Absolutely.
Just when we figure out the code, we got to stop using this many number of hashtags. You got to stop using certain terms in your post, things like that. Just unspoken rules that you won't know about until you get shadow banned. It's just tiring. Like,
that's what they did with civil rights. That's what they did with civil rights. They were like, "Oh, black people getting too free. Okay, we gonna craft civil rights.
Yep.
And it's gonna look like we bout this is, but we're gonna trick everybody into thinking, yo, that's exactly what that was."
Yes, wow. Yes, absolutely. But we could talk about this all day. That in itself is a full episode. Like, there's just so much to unpack there. But I know we're a little bit past the hour, so let's close out with the lightning round. Just a few quick hitter questions, and then we'll wrap things up. So, you're doing all this work, a lot of heavy lifting. What does Key do for self-care?
Yeah, I think self-care is ultimately has to be intertwined with community care. And we're constantly told that, like, there's a self-care culture and it feels still very individualistic. And oftentimes the individualism just aligns itself with capitalism because that's what it is. So you're like, oh, I'm going to go do these things for myself. And really, I'm like, actually, the best self-care that I do is reaching out to my community when I need that. Yes. And so I have like my crew of people who I either like FaceTime. I never liked FaceTime before, never used to get on the phone, but these people make me feel safe enough to engage with them. So I'm reaching out to people. I also try to be in nature as much as I can. Especially having like been in the house, like I'll wake up early and like take my dogs for a walk in the park. I'm lucky enough to live by a park. So just being outside and trying to teach myself to breathe. I have a really hard time just breathing, which I think speaks volumes, but that's what I do for myself. I have dedicated, like, when I wake up in the morning, sometimes caring for myself means it takes an entire day because I'm in pain, because I have chronic illness. So that's what it is. So I'm not about to answer your email. And if you feel like I'm not worthy of this opportunity because I've been caring for myself, oh, well, it wasn't for me. Like, I do not trip. So what I do is I center myself in my care physically, mentally, emotionally for as long as I need that to happen. That is the beginning of my day. And then everything else comes after that. So community, nature, and making sure that I start my days really focusing on what it is that I need that's going to make me be able to do the rest of what I need to do for the day.
No, that's real talk. Community is key. We gotta be around our loved ones and those who are about the life that we're about. So that's definitely important. One underrated talent that people don't know about when it comes to you, because you have so many talents, but is there an underrated one that people just don't know about?
I'm funny. I think if you don't know me, I'm like super witty, but also can like come up with anything on the spot. So I think one of my underrated talents is, and that people don't really know, is like I'm really good at writing poems about literally anything, and writing songs. And can also freestyle, make up a song to just about any and everything, which is why I think my kids like me, because I was funny, always making up songs. But I do songwrite. So like the albums and the EP and LP that we put out with my partner Sonic, Keep You Posted, and Seasons. Like, I wrote a lot of the songs on that. And also I studied film photography for a long time. And so I really I love photography. So I do a lot of kind of like shooting work, not really, I don't really like the professional, like that's not my vibe. People have asked me to do things like that, but you know, if homies need something, or like within my creative team, I'm the person who takes pictures, and I love photography. And so you'll often find me with like primarily my film camera, you know, up and out. So I will say that, like, funny. I don't care what anybody says. I know. And writing songs, shooting film.
For real. But the funny part, I always thought you were funny because you always be posting the crazy TikTok videos, and you do post some of your poems as well. So if y'all haven't checked out some of Key's poetry, it's super dope. Make sure y'all check that out. But she does post some of that work out from time to time. Yeah, for sure.
They.
They. Sorry, misgendering. See, I'm learning.
It's okay. It's that simple, right? When you make the mistake, you say, "Ooh, like, my bad. Like, I misgendered you. I'm using they." And that's a lesson for everybody listening. It's like, it really can be that simple, where you just continue on. You stop yourself. My bad. Hold yourself accountable. Fix it, and we keep it moving. So we good.
There you go. Appreciate that, and the accountability. So are there 3 songs right now that are on your playlist right now? Like, what songs you listening to right now? What you rocking to?
I am that person who will be listening to the same things over and over and over. And so if I find anything new, it's because my partner sends me songs, because she's the singer songwriter, or my homies who are like producers, engineers, like they send me songs. But I'll be that person that listens to the same stuff, like, over and over. And I'm really like, I don't think Groove Me by Guy is never not on my mind. I don't listen to that song. Like, I literally, my dude, like, I'm not even lying to you, like New Jack Swing, like 90s, early 2000s R&B is really truly my jam. And if you played Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, like CSR was my radio station. That's really what got me hit. Like, so that's always on my mind. I also really love, we're about to put like a dance remix out of my partner Sonic, her song Unwanted, and our homie Solar, who's our engineer, multi-instrumentalist, producer extraordinaire. It like can produce anything, created this dance remix of Unwanted, and we dropping that on June 13th, which is my partner's birthday. So stay tuned for that. That's on my playlist. And also, I would say, I recently got into an artist that we featured, who formerly as an artist went by Offset when we featured them at our concert, goes by Yasmin Bretz. And she just put out her EP, and it's fire. Or not even EP, she put out a whole album. And to see her growth over the years as a lyricist. And again, this is a Black trans woman. And I'm telling you, we like Black trans people are out here creating music. So check out Yasmin Bretz. Like, that whole project, that's on my playlist right now.
All right, cool. So check out Sonic, Solar, Yasmin Bretz, you said? How do you spell the last name?
Bratz.
Got it. Yeah, so let's make sure we check them out. All right.
Oh, and the last person, because I always got to give it up to my homies, Sierra Shawn. Period. Sierra, Siaira, Shawn, SHAWN. Like, literally, like, one of the most underrated artists in existence. Like, her voice is like butter. She's one of the best songwriters I've ever encountered in my entire life. All her projects are fire.
All right, so we got all 4. So we'll make sure we shout them out. Definitely put them in the post for sure. And then last question. If you can invite 3 people, 3 influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be for you?
Yeah, so if I would just even say people, because I don't want to conflate any type of influence with the first person I'm about to say, because very similar to what's happening with people being like, George Floyd is so influential, and like the violence around that. I would invite a child, Nigel Shelby, who died by suicide. He was a Black queer kid who was 15 when he died by suicide. I would invite him because, like I told you before, like, I wish that all of our kids could see us, could feel us, could know that there is like life beyond the type of oppressive circumstances and violent circumstances that they are currently living, you know, and to see our babies hurting and in pain like that, and it just continues to happen. I would just invite Nigel and be like, listen, we're here for you. We're here right now. Like, you know, that's the first person I even thought of. I think I really struggled to decide. Like, I mean, I don't know. I would want to invite Asaka Shakur and Angela Davis just because, like, I need them in my life. Talk about like just really truly learning and understanding what like fighting for liberation actually looks like in practice, like for real. So that's really difficult. Yeah, you told me 3. That's 3. But right now I would say also I've been watching the show Legendary, which I absolutely love. It brings me the most joy. If you don't know Legendary, it's like the ballroom competition where houses across the nation battle in the show Legendary on HBO Max. And there's a house currently called the House of Tishi. And I absolutely like, I just find they're just brilliant, incredible, like everything that they do, just even down to the fact that like how much they love each other. And houses literally are abolitionist in nature because these are Black, queer, and trans people who create their own families, right? Like I literally look at ballroom to be like, oh, what do we need to do? Because Black, queer, and trans people have been doing this. And these many of these house mothers are Black trans women. They've been doing this. So I would invite House of Tishi as well, as a collective unit, because I'm using that as a collective unit. I would invite them and just, you know, kiki with them and really kind of lean into that type of revolutionary love that they give one another. So yeah, those would be my folks.
Listen, I'm flexible. We'll create more space for the table, no doubt. I'm flexible.
Right, tables don't exist. We just do what we want. We do what we want. Ain't no limit.
For real. Nah, for real. And besides, we need to bring more people to the table anyway. So that's just an unlimited number.
We need to abolish the table, create something different. So I stay telling people like the table is always going to be a table, no matter how you set it, no matter how fancy you make it. It don't matter. It's still going to be the table. So F the table. What else we doing?
You could have made a song with that. I felt like you were about to you're about to throw a bar in there. I felt it coming. Nah, that's what's up. But Key, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been a dope conversation. And thank you for holding me accountable, because this is a learning process, not just for myself, but for everybody. And this is how we start to decolonize our thinking. This is how we start to change the way that our schools are. And we create space for our students, regardless of who they are and how they express themselves. So I appreciate everything that you do.
Absolutely. Accountability is truly the antithesis of the, you know, prison industrial complex, because we're not talking about punishing, right? Or, you know, harming people. We're literally talking about like accountability as love. And we can do that. We can have empathy and accountability at the same time. So I appreciate you having me on. I know we both came into this not feeling well. I know I feel better after having been in this conversation with you. And I think that speaks volumes to, again, who are you in community with? You know, who are the people that make you feel loved and affirmed and safe and protected? And I felt like that in this space. So thanks for having me. It's been really real. If you make it to the end of this podcast, let me clap it up for you, because it's been a long time. And my ADHD don't work like that. But if you bout it, good for you. And thank you for listening.
Nah, no doubt. And I think we're just in this microwave social media era where long form content doesn't get the appreciation it deserves. And that's sometimes when we're talking about these very important and pertinent issues, we can't just put it in a 15 to 20-minute time frame. It's just so hard to do. We have to elaborate and expound on these different things because the conversation is so nuanced.
Absolutely. 100%. I agree with you.
Yes. But thank you again. And before you go, please let people know how they can get with you on social media, follow your work. You can even go ahead and share the Woke Kindergarten website and everything else.
Sure, yeah. So you can follow Woke Kindergarten at Woke Kindergarten. You can follow Black Children Play at Black Children Play. If you're interested in like the music component, you can follow at Sisters Unsigned. My personal Instagram, you can find on Woke Kindergarten. It's really for folks who just want to like actually like me as a human, because you might just like my work. Who never knows? And then on Twitter, I'm at Akiea G, Akia G. I do primarily go by Key though. That doesn't mean I don't love my name, but I feel more like Key in this iteration of who I am currently. And you can find Woke Kindergarten on every single kind of digital platform you can think of. So Woke Kindergarten on YouTube, Woke Kindergarten on TikTok. The Woke Kindergarten TikTok is geared towards children. So it is a safe place for children to just go watch like Woke Kindergarten TikTok. My TikTok as an adult is different, but Woke Kindergarten TikTok is for kids. And then also, where else are we on? Oh yeah, www.wokekindergarten.org. And so that's our website. And please join our Patreon community. It's our sustainability community. Y'all have really been holding me down because I walked away from a severance that didn't align with my values, having mutually separated from a job. So Woke Kindergarten is what I do now. Patreon community is really super dope. You can join at patreon.com/Woke Kindergarten. There are no paywalls. Again, it's not a production space. So you're not coming to consume what I'm giving you. If I create something, I offer it. You know, if I don't, I don't. It really is about how can we really lean into community sustainability and what does that look like without requiring people to produce for you. So that's really where we at. So follow us there, stay tuned. Always offering kind of like workshops in community and opportunities to like be in spaces with folks to do this work together. So again, thanks for having me.
No doubt. And did you mention the YouTube channel? Did you mention that?
YouTube. Okay. Yes, YouTube is Woke Kindergarten as well. That's where you will find all the Woke Read Aloud, 60-second text, et cetera, et cetera. And we got some new things coming. So definitely stay tuned for that. And you'll find probably announcements for all of the new things on the Instagram.
No doubt. But of course, you'll release that when you are ready, right? Because you're going by your timeline, and that's part of just maintaining the boundaries. So prioritize the self-care for sure. Prioritize that. But appreciate you, Key, and I'm gonna let you live and get some rest. And we'll connect soon.
Yes, you too. Thanks for having me, Kwame. Have a good one. All right.
No doubt. You too. All right, people. So we're about to end another episode of Dane Talk Educators Live. But before we roll out, I just want to make a couple of announcements because people have been asking me about this. First and foremost, we do have our Dane Talk apparel, which is still in stock. We have shirts for librarians, shirts for classroom teachers, all professionals within education profession, and it's just going to continue to grow. So if you're someone who wants to go into the summer with some swag to get you ready for the next school year, make sure you visit the Teespring shop at teesprings.com/stores/the Identity Talk Apparel Shop. So make sure you check us out there. And then finally, for anybody who's looking for some professional development to start off the next school year or even during the summertime, we do have our Shape the Teacher Identity 101 program, which is self-paced. So you don't need to rush through it to meet a timeline. It's at your own learning pace. And if you're interested in learning about culturally responsive teaching, anti-racist practices, classroom management, lesson planning, and all these other aspects of our craft, make sure you book a call with us at kindly.com/IDTALK4 educators. And those are the announcements. And we are about to sign off. So until next time, people, I want to wish you a good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.